morning, everyone. I just returned from AIPAC yesterday, which is an incredible experience. And there's so many beautiful and inspiring moments. But one of the many inspiring moments was on the stage. During one of the sessions, they had Natan Sharansky and his daughter come on stage and have a conversation, a father and a daughter. Now this daughter is already married and she has her own children, and she's a religious woman. She came on the stage with her hair covered. You could see that she's a religious woman. And they talked about, their family. And what emerged from the conversation was, one of the things she said, here you have Natan's father, who was raised under Stalin during communism. Natan became a refusnik and immigrated to Israel. And the daughter grew up as a Jew in Israel, and now is a religious woman. And one of the things she said that had the biggest impact was the Friday night Shabbat dinners. Because apparently Natan's parents, at least the mother, also immigrated. And she remembers the conversations between her grandmother, her father, and herself, and the lively conversations around the Shabbat dinner. And she talked about the fact that every subject was open for discussion, and the more they disagreed on the Shabbat table, the more lively the conversation was. They were not afraid to talk about the hard questions of life, and whether she gave an example. She said we would debate at the Shabbat table whether God created man or man created God. Because her grandmother came from the Soviet Union, so he didn't necessarily raised with the idea that God created the world. So did God create man or did man create God? So every subject was open. And this week's parsha talks about Shabbat. And it says, the opening commandment says that you should keep the day of Shabbat. 6 days you should work, you should rest on the seventh day. And why is this introduced in this week's parsha? Because it's telling us that you should not violate Shabbat for the building of the Mishkan. As important as building the Mishkan was, on Shabbat they had to rest. Because Shabbat is even more important than the building of the Mishkan. Why is Shabbat so important? So they tell an analogy of a guy walking through the forest, and he sees two people sawing a log. Two people back and forth sawing a log. He goes on a long walk. 4 or 5 hours later, he comes back, he sees the same two people sawing the log. He says, what are you doing? You've been doing this for 5 hours. He says, yeah, the blade is very dull. It takes a long time to saw the log. So he says, why don't you stop and sharpen the blade? And they say, we're too busy. We don't have time to stop and sharpen the blade. We have too much work to do. Man sometimes gets so caught up in their work, 7 days a week, 24/7 today with technology, that you never stop to think, what is this all about? What's the purpose? How can I live my life better? How could I have more fulfillment and happiness and meaning and family and community? And we're so preoccupied with the rat race or the hamster cycle that we never sharpen our tools. What are our tools? The mind that God gave us, the heart that God gave us, to think better, to learn better, to understand this world better, to love better, to communicate better, to connect better, spiritual sharpness. So Shabbos tells us, take a break and re-examine the past week, the future week, your dreams, your goals, your aspirations, where you're going. And here you saw 4 generations, Natan Sharansky's parents, Natan, his daughter, and her children. And you saw what links all the families? Shabbat. Shabbat is the glue that brings the family together. And I once heard that, what's the difference between, there's a house and a home, right? The house is the physical structure. The home is the family inside the house. Today, a lot of people work hard to build big houses. They want to give their kids 20 bedrooms and tennis courts and jacuzzis, whatever they want to build in their house. But a house doesn't make a home. What makes a home is the love in the family. You could have a tiny little apartment somewhere with a big family cramped into a small apartment, but when they sit around the Shabbat table, they're a family. There's a home. And then you could have a big home, a big house, but there's no home. Shabbat tells us, make sure that you build a mishpacha, a family. And there's no greater tool to do that than the day of Shabbat, which is the greatest gift that Hashem gave the Jewish people.